So we're back. It's been several days, and that because I've been trying to get this burner cap off, and in this case discretion is going to be the better part of valor. This burner cap is is just not going to come off. So I showed you, I think before I broke for the last video, it needs to unscrew from the bottom here, and these just aren't going anywhere. I've tried penetrating oil, I've tried heating and quenching numerous times. It's been sitting for ages, and this screw doesn't want to budge at all. This, I actually got about a quarter turn out of it, but it was really obvious I was just twisting the screw. So it's going to stay the way it is, and since I've been able to see inside the other burner cap, there's nothing in there. It's not like a Coleman Band of Blue burner where you want to get all those little rings with the flat rings and the corrugated rings apart so you can clean them so that it burns well. As you'll see, these are just empty inside, and it's got this ring around it. So we can get it clean, and I'll just make a point of blowing it out with compressed air to cut down on the rust. Also, the generator tube is not going to come out of the valve itself, but the good news is all the guts came out, so we can clean everything. So I've temporarily put everything back together for your benefit so you can see how all of this works, how it comes apart. Maybe you've got one of these on your own. It took me a second. I thought, well, if the generator, how does that come out when both of these are fixed, and when the tank has these, I don't know if they're rivets or what they are, but they're swaged in there. So unless you grind those off, the tank isn't coming off, which means we may not get quite the polish on this that I would like, but I'll see what happens. So I figured out this has to come off of the chassis first. So it's got screws in the bottom and square nuts on top that hold them on. Again, these are just finger tight at this point. And these screws come out, or they should. It's hung up on it's not quite square, so it's hung up on that. There we go. All right, now we'll take this screw off of the generator. Hopefully that one wasn't seized up. And now the whole manifold, and burners come off. So we'll set that aside for a moment. The generator tip, there is normally a spring in there. I did not put the spring back in because it was a chore to get it out, and I don't want to have to fish it out again. You can see the generator tip, so we'll just unscrew the valve. And that threads into the tip of the valve just like on a Coleman. And we'll take this the valve stem packing nut. It's got a graphite packing in there, just again like a Coleman. Again, this won't come off. The fuel cap is fine. I'm going to leave that on for now because this is going to get wet, and I want to avoid getting water where it doesn't have to go. But in order to clean the generator out and all of that, we're going to end up getting some water in the tank. Thankfully, it's brass, so I don't have to worry about rust. Now, this was a little bit like a Chinese puzzle box. The burners are easy. And this primary burner came apart very easily, probably because it was one that was hot all the time, and heat has a tendency or a way of breaking down the rust. So you can see it's got a hole in the middle, and actually it's some of the same material they use for the burners here, spot welded on there, and that so flame comes up directly under the generator to help keep it hot. And then we've got our flame ring. So the flame comes out through these holes. So you can see this burner's just like that, so I'm not too worried about getting in there to remove any rust or anything like that. Now the other part, you can actually see how this valve works for the secondary burner, the auxiliary. That's closed. When you pull it over, that hole causes it to open. And this is simply held on with these two screws and a little plate. This almost leads me, looking at this plate and the screws, it almost leads me to believe that this manifold was perhaps painted with black paint at one point. I've been trying to decide what to do to treat it. I thought about bluing or something like that, and then this just drops out of that slot. Now, there's the diverter, which diverts gasoline. Instead of going down through the manifold, it drops down and it fills the preheat cup here. And then there's like another overflow cup underneath the preheat cup, I guess just in case it runs down around the manifold. That way it doesn't go into the bottom of the case. That's a nice little extra that's unnecessary. I've never seen one on a Coleman, and yeah, sometimes on a Coleman you'll end up with gas in the bottom of the case while you're preheating. So it's nice they did that. So looking at this, you can see there's a cotter pin. It took some work to get that out, but interestingly enough, it was never splayed apart. It was just stuck in there, and I guess rust was holding it in place. And then the puzzle box part, finally figured out, if you rotate all of this, let's see if I've got that right. If I rotate it and then move this plate forward, it falls out. So we've got that part off. And then this part can then slide out, the preheat cup itself, and then the diverter just falls right out, and it's got a pin through there, but it's crimped on the inside, so we're going to leave that alone. So the diverter's kind of interesting looking, so that it goes in there, and when you lift it up, instead of going down that tube, the gas hits the back wall here, and it just drops straight down into the preheat cup. So that's as far as we're going to get that apart. I think we can get everything cleaned up. So I am going to quickly hit these with Simple Green to get some of the penetrating oil off so it doesn't make too big of a mess in my citric acid pot. And then we'll put these steel parts and some of the brass parts in citric acid, and I'll start cleaning up the tank and the chassis. Got some stove soup cooking. On one side over here we've got the brass. That knob will come out pretty soon. I don't want it to get damaged, but the citric acid in there will help deal with the brass and the valve stem to make sure everything's clean and working right. And then over here we've got the steel parts. That'll take a bit longer in there. I'll have to flip those legs over to get the other side. But we'll let this stuff sit in here for at least 30 minutes or so, and that should get it nice and clean, and then we'll hit it with some steel wool to get everything off. Progress is being made. All of the steel parts, in fact pretty much all the parts, have been cleaned up in citric acid and rubbed down with steel wool. This is a manifold. It's all sort of clean now and de-rusted, and even got this auxiliary burner pretty well cleaned up, even though we can't get it apart. So we're getting closer, but something fun now. I kind of wondered if this might be the case because initially this fuel tank appeared to be painted, and yet it was non-ferrous, so I figured it was clearly brass, and that meant it was probably lacquered. So you can see, I even let this sit in citric acid a bit to see what it would do, and this end, the lacquer was very thin. You can see the drip marks on the bottom, so I'm not quite sure how they lacquered this. It's lacquered all around, but it's got drips on it running this way. But what I found is this end, the lacquer is much thicker And I did hit that with the polishing wheel or the buffing wheel. On this end where it was thin, it burned right through very, very easily. This end, not so much. And I've, short of using paint stripper, I've tried a few solvents, including acetone, and it's old, nothing really cuts it. So I'm probably gonna just have to burn through this with my polishing wheel and some polishing compound. I don't like to clog up the wheel that way, but it's getting old and needs to be replaced anyway. So let's see what I can show you on the polishing wheel. It does work all right on the thinner lacquer. Let's try this end part. See, it doesn't burn through quite so easily. This is interesting. What I had thought was textured lacquer, where it was thicker, that's actually the brass. I've taken the lacquer off, and the brass is just, it's textured on this end. Assuming that somehow, however they formed these tanks, that was the end product. So anyhow, I'm going to keep polishing this, and this is going to be a bit of a challenge to get in here because I can't get the generator off. And I can't remove the tank from the chassis, but I'm going to do the best I can working in here. I might have to get a Dremel tool out or do some of this by hand with some of that metal polish that I showed you before. But when you see me next, this will be all polished up. All right, everything is cleaned, everything is shined that should be shined, the case is polished up and looks beautiful. The tank came out pretty nicely, all things considered. I had to get in with a Dremel to do some of the polishing in the tight spots, but I think that came out pretty nicely. So now it's time to put this thing back together, and we'll start simple here with the fuel cap. Make sure the seal and the check valve are still working. Now we'll take the generator needle, the valve wheel, and the generator tip. And somewhere in here there's the spring, and we've got the spring. So, and we need the valve stem nut. So the valve stem wheel is threaded. So pretty much just like a Coleman at this point. And drop the packing nut over. I'm going to put the needle in after I get this in. Tighten that up. I'm doing this backwards for you. That feels pretty good. And you can see the cleaning needle is here. So we'll just feed the spring on once it's going into the generator. Make sure that that's all clean. I can see light through the generator tip, so that's good. I see a nice open round hole. One of the things I was finding before with this stove is I kind of had to tweak where the needle was in order to get fuel flowing. Right. So there we've got the tank and the generator. Now let's set this aside and let's put the manifold back together. So we need to, these go with the holes down and the solid side up. And this is the rest for the generator. And our two long screws. And it should be pretty self-centering, but I did notice the casting on the cap is pretty rough. So it's always good to double check. All right, got that. Now we'll put together the diverter and let's see, we need a cotter pin for that. All right, now this was the Chinese puzzle box. That goes in there and the open side goes toward the generator. So we'll put that in. And then this went underneath. And this eventually, it's going to sit like that. So as I recall, we had to get this on first and then get that underneath and oriented around. And there we go. And then we pushed. All right, sorry I had to do that off camera. I had to go put that on the vise and do a little pounding on it. That is one tenacious cotter pin that does not want to bend, but we've got everything in place here with a little bit of flexibility, which it originally did have. So I think that's good. Now we need to put the auxiliary valve control in here. So that just slides in. This is much nicer than it was before. This is simply held in with this piece and two screws. usually think of myself as having stubby fingers, but boy. Much smoother movement than we had before. All right, this way. And now to mount it, this goes on here. Remember, we had to take the whole manifold and burner assembly off in order to deal with the generator. So we get that lined up and on here. And then we've got a couple of screws and a couple of these nice little square nuts. Suddenly I become all thumbs when I've got this oriented the wrong way in order to show the camera, so I'm just going to have to flip it down here and use my right hand the right way. And there we go. Now, one last screw. This guy just holds the generator there. I guess it's the backup or the safety. Now we'll set this aside because there's one last thing we need to do with the case. To put these legs in. The legs have a slight bow and that goes to the outside. And actually, since I cleaned up these, de-rusted them, cleaned up the ends, notice they're suddenly, and with the case polished inside, these legs seem to move better. I found it kind of remarkable that the way these legs, they slide up and down inside the case. In fact, you can see it where it's slightly bowed out from that, and somehow they hadn't worn through the paint. Oh, I did, didn't I? I put this together backwards. All right, there we go, and I'm going to leave the side flap open, or closed rather, so you can still see what's going on over here. But there is one last thing we need to do before we get this going, and that's to put the pump together. I had said before I thought it went with the stove. It came with the stove, and it does in fact go with the stove. Once I got the brass cleaned up, I can see it says Prentiss-Wabers Product Company. So, the pump handle, we will put the cap on first. then the spring, and then there's a thread-on backer for the pump leather, and that will need to tighten down. Now the pump leather I've had sitting here in some leather conditioner while we worked on the stove. Let's put that. It's snug enough, it actually wants to thread on. There's a little washer that goes inside. A nut that holds it all in place. We'll add a bit of oil. I use 3-in-1 oil. Neat's Foot oil is what at least Coleman used from the factory and sold as in tubes to oil pump cups. I've said before in other videos, pretty much any oil works. The main thing is not to use vegetable oil because it gets nasty. In a pinch, if you're in an emergency, you can use vegetable oil, but you want to clean it up, remove it, something, maybe replace the pump leather rather than just letting it sit forever, because you won't be happy with what happens to it over time. I think I've said you could even use the oil from the dipstick in your car, which I have done on one occasion. Perfect. So, through the magic of video editing, I will be back to you in a moment, and this will be full of gasoline. We are now gassed up and ready to fire this. So I will take the pump, just like on a quick light. We'll unscrew the top of the fuel cap, put the pump on, and pump away. Pressure in there now. Looks great. You remember there's this diverter here that diverts the fuel, so instead of going down into the manifold, it fills this cup. So I'm going to open this valve left-handed, I guess. I don't need a lot of fuel. Should be more than enough. And we'll light it. Now, this is different than a Coleman hot blast stove. A hot blast stove, you put a little bit of gas in the preheat cup, that starts preheating, and the fuel in the generator then just starts, because it's hitting sort of a backsplash or backstop that diverts the fuel. The generator creates this hot blast effect as the gas hits it, or as it heats up. This doesn't do that because there's nothing diverting the fuel coming out of the generator, so instead it just fires up the primary burner. And it doesn't take long, as you can see, to preheat. So the burner's running pretty well. It was. Back up. It tends to do this on the first fire up when it's cold. If we open the valve further, it'll purge the air out faster, and that seems to be what's happening. The cold generator gets air in it, and until all that air is purged out, it sort of pops like this and blows out. I think Coleman's hot blast feature dealt with this issue. So I think we should be good now. But it shows you just how little fuel is actually flowing through these, that you can have that much, you can have it running that long and have that much air in the generator and in the system. Got to purge air out of the manifold as well. It takes that long to purge all of that out. So now we'll just pull open the secondary and light that. And there we go. The Prentiss-Wabers Auto-Cook-Kit No. 4, made roughly 1927 to 1929. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you found it helpful, especially that part about working on this paint and restoring it. It's not necessary to strip them, and it's not necessary to just leave it dull and oxidized. There are things you can do to fix it up. Maybe I'll work on another stove with similar issues soon, and we can see what we can do with one that's in rougher condition. But for now, that's it. Thanks for watching.